Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, where we continue to discover what makes a bestseller and inspire you to start, finish and publish your book. I'm Mark Stay, and Mr. DeVoe is still off for the moment, and we send Mr. D all our love and good wishes. But we do have a guest co-presenter this week, the author of historical fantasy, including novels The Way Home, The Ivory Gate, The Seven Hills, as well as the Viking-inspired serial Tooth and Blade, whose audiobook is just fantastic. He produced and directed that. You may have seen him at the Oz Comic Con. You've most likely heard him on the podcast before. He edits my short stories and self-pub stuff, and he knows all my bad habits. Also, he taught Greek and Roman history at the University of Queensland, which makes him the perfect co-host for this week's special guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Julian Barr. Julian, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm fantastic, Mark. How are you?
Tickety-boo, thank you. Thank you so much for stepping in this week. And I could not imagine a better week. The author we've got this week is one. It's such a treat to speak to our special guest, but also this is right up your Roman road, isn't it? Simon Scarrow.
Oh, you bet. I can't wait.
Excellent stuff. Well, Simon Scarrow, our special guest, is probably best known for his series, The Eagles of the Empire, that began in 2000 with the first book, Under the Eagle, and it features the Roman soldier heroes Cato and Macro. The latest in that series, Death to the Emperor, is the 21st book in the series. Simon's also written novels about Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington, The Siege of Malta. He's written contemporary thrillers. He's now back with a second Berlin wartime thriller, Dead of Night, and we talk about both those new books, Death to the Emperor and Dead of Night. So we discuss planning versus over-planning, why authors need to learn to trust the reader, and he's got some great tips for research and collaborating with other writers. So do please enjoy. Simon Scarrow, welcome to the Bestseller Experiment. How are you today, sir?
Very well.
Good. Now, you're such a prolific author. We've not got one book to talk about today. We've got two. Not least, we've got Death to the Emperor, which I believe is the 21st book in the Eagles of the Empire series. And then we've got Dead of Night, which is your second Berlin wartime thriller. I think what I'd like to do is start with Dead of Night, and then we'll come to the Eagles of the Empire in a moment, because that is such a phenomenon. But this is absolutely fascinating to me, because you're writing about a criminal inspector, Horst Schenker, I believe his name is, who is an honest cop in a criminal regime, and he's an expert in an era when expertise is resented by those in power, which sounds all too familiar. But tell us about and it's the follow-up to Blackout, which is the first novel in the series. So tell us about Dead of Night and Blackout, the story behind it. How did these come about?
Well, they came about actually as an idea for a novel I was going to write that was going to be set in Alderney during the Second World War. Ah. And because I've been going there for a number of years to the literary festival, which, in case the other writers listening are interested, is one to get yourself into, because I think it's the best literary festival anywhere that I've been to, frankly. Partly because it's so sort of compact and small, and that the speakers outnumber the audience. But it's the kind of island where, you throw a stick, you're going to hit in the audience an ex-spy or somebody from the SAS or some sort of senior banker or something, because they all seem to retire there. And it's an absolutely fascinating place. But it's also the only place where there was on British soil during the Second World War, where there was a concentration camp. So I thought, wow, this is quite interesting, because it's a lovely twee little island. It's very much like Curran Island, actually, by Enid Blyton. That's what it reminds me of. So rocky coastline, forts and castles, and seagulls swirling around them, and these beautiful beaches and clear water, and so on. And I thought, well, what an amazing setting, because it's only 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. And there were something like 6,000 inmates of the concentration camps and 3,000 German soldiers, packed into this island. And I thought, well, what a lovely kind of closed setting for a murder mystery, set during this time. But then I thought, okay, so the guy who's going to investigate this is going to be a cop sent over from Berlin to see what's going on. And then I realized that this would actually have to be a punishment, because that's what happened. You were sent to Alderney if you'd done something wrong. A bit like in Coventry, I guess. But so what happened was, I thought, well, I better do some research into Berlin and see what it was like being a police officer in Berlin. And what could this guy have done that would be so bad that would get him sent to Alderney? And in the process of researching that, I thought, there's loads of stories here. It's just a most incredible setting, as you say, trying to be an honest person in a thoroughly corrupt and brutal dictatorship. How do you kind of manage that? And I thought, wow, blimey, what a setting. So, the Alderney book will appear later in the series,
right,
but I thought, well, the best thing to do is just start at the beginning of the war and write the series through it. So as the war develops, obviously you're going to have more rationing, bombing, all these sorts of things, and in the background, the news of what's going on, and how people are kind of developing strategies to live under fascism during a war, this sort of thing. So, it all came from there, really. And I want to try, if I can, to extend it just past the end of the Second World War, because I think when the city's in ruins and it's an occupied nation and so on, there's still a need for law and order. But how do you do it, from a highly bureaucratic, functional dictatorship to complete ruins? There's got to be, and someone's struggling to kind of keep law going at that time. So I do have a broad story arc worked out for this. And it's not as if the Nazis don't provide plenty of subject matter.
Yeah, quite exactly. When you say you've got a broad story arc, I often find this, certainly readers tend to have a misconception that you have every single story beat planned out until the end of the series. But when you say broad story arc, you've essentially, the war. We all know the war ended. Yeah. We all know there was chaos at the end of the war. You've got a vague finishing line that you're heading towards, or do you know the specifics?
No. This is one of the things that it took me a while to realize as a writer, is that it's wrong to overplan. So I know, that's just my personal take on it, because I know writers who do, and they're very, very successful. But I like to see. I know where a story is going to be set. I know roughly what period it'll cover. I know who maybe the villain will be and what the problem is to be solved and so on. But everything else is up for grabs. And as you're writing the story, things happen that surprise you. Characters will say things and do things that you think, well, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
If you overplan it, of course, then I was watching a television series on BBC last night with David Tennant and Tucci, Inside Man, I think it is.
Okay. It's
called. And it's a sort of crime thing. But the point is, it's so obviously everything is structured around the idea that the author, the writer has had for this crime and how it's going to work out. And everybody's going to be forced, into that rut. And you can feel it. You can feel that this is just ludicrous. People are doing things which no normal person would do, and reacting in ways no normal person, purely for the purpose of the plot that's been worked out for it. And I think readers begin to see through that. And I think there's a line. I saw it. I make a note of these things occasionally, but there was something that Robert Frost once said, and he said it was no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And you think, yeah, absolutely. That's kind of how it has to be. When you're writing a book, you need to be surprised by the material. If you aren't, then there's a good possibility the reader won't be.
Yeah, very, very true. Very true. Now, this certainly, Blackout and Dead of Night, no shortage of surprises and thrills in here. But this came with your publicist sent over your research notes for this. This book goes to some very, very dark places. I mean, we're talking about, the Nazis experimenting with the murder of people with disabilities and mental illnesses, and it's incredibly disturbing. One of the conversations we've been having on the podcast recently is about this idea of maybe going too far. Can you ever go too far describing these things, and how do you keep the reader engaged without overwhelming them or putting them off? And here you're talking about possibly the most evil thing of the 20th century, and it's all done in such a calm and calculated way as well. The Holocaust didn't happen by accident. So how conscious are you of overwhelming the reader with too much of this kind of horror?
Well, there's, you say, the Nazis is, the worst thing that happened in the 20th century and stuff. And you're thinking, yes, that's true. But I think there is a kind of convenient way in which they are, I'm not, scapegoating is probably too strong a word for it, But for example, the Nazis, when they came to power, very much bought into the idea of compulsory sterilization. So, mixed race people, handicapped people, et cetera, et cetera. So they had a whole raft of people. If you didn't fit into the blueprint for the Herrenvolk, basically you were fair game for this sort of thing. What tends to get overlooked is the fact that other nations have been doing this on a pretty industrial scale themselves for much longer. United States, for example, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. We think of Scandinavia as this kind of liberal paradise, perched on top of the north of Europe, whatever. But Norway didn't stop compulsory sterilizations until the 1970s. And that's quite an eye opener.
Wow.
So, when you look at the numbers of people who are, being forced into this process, the Nazis, weren't alone in it. And somehow, Nazi Germany becomes this catch-all for all those sorts of evils that go on. And it's very nice and, easy for us to project all this stuff onto, Nazi Germany and say, hey, but the rest of us were pretty cool, weren't we? And then there was a conference 2 years before the war broke out, when it was quite clear that, Nazi policies were having a pretty unpleasant effect on the Jewish population in Germany. And there was an international conference that was held in Switzerland to decide, what to do with the Jews. And a lot of nations were represented there. And none of them was prepared to help out. They were absolutely riven by anti-Semitism themselves. And somehow Nazi Germany gets the, everything bundled on it on that. So that's not to say that they weren't, the most evil regime, I think, in history. They are, I think. I can't think of anything that tops it when you look at what they do. And there's another aspect to that, which I thought, is a pretty dark thing, but, we're all too familiar with it in various ways in the modern world, which is the way that people who are involved in the Holocaust in a very kind of incremental way. So somebody developed the gas. Somebody developed a design for the extermination chambers. Somebody designed the crematoria. And, they knew kind of what they were doing, but nobody told them, in specific detail. So nobody had to sort of own up to that. And if you atomize the guilt and the knowledge, people begin to sort of find ways of coping with that. And they think, well, I just did this. How was I to know that this was the way it was going to be used? And a lot of these people had very, very successful careers after the war. Albert Widman, who was the guy I mentioned in the book, who was working for the forensic department, forensic research labs for the CRIPO, the Criminal Investigation Police, was a guy who was sort of seconded to come up with the design for the first gas chambers. And afterwards has a very successful career as a scientist in a paint company. This is kind of what goes on. It's the same with, as I say, in more modern times. I had a good friend at university who was doing a research degree funded by Dow Chemical to make napalm burn more furiously under better conditions. I sort of said, how you know what this is going to be used for? Yeah. And he said, well, I'm more concerned with the problem of how to get this chemical reaction to be more, expansive. And I thought, well, yeah, but what this will be used for. And he just somehow managed to compartmentalize that. And I think, this is one of the scariest things, I think, of totalitarian dictatorships and bureaucracies, is the degree to which people can absolve themselves from the big crimes by claiming only a small part in it.
So is that, coming back to the original question, do you think that compartmentalization is something that the reader does? You can put those horrors into a fictional setting and the reader can go, okay, I'm at a distance from that. That's not happening to me. Therefore, I can engage with it. Do you think there's something in that?
No, really, because, writing a book and reading a book, there are two parts of the same process. So if a reader, reading is a very creative act. And if you do it well, then you kind of become part of the setting that's been related to you. And reading is a skill, I think. This is one of the things that's very much left to one side. Everybody goes on about, oh, well, look at what the author's done. The author's basically put black marks on white paper. What the reader does is put those, take those black marks, and then mentally projecting this thing in their head. And if they're good, they really create an experience for themselves. So, you can't really, if you're a good reader, distance yourself from the content of the book. And I think if the book's any good, then, the reader and the reader's good, then it's this thing, you start with another little, Robert Frostism is that you start with. He's talking about poetry. He says it should start with delight and end in wisdom. Now, I think from writing, I think the same thing. You start with a crime novel, and by the end of it, I hope the reader's going to think, "Crikey, this is what totalitarianism looks like. This is what happens if you take your eye off the ball as a citizen in a democracy." And hopefully that's kind of something people take away from it at the end.
Wonderful. That's a great answer. Thank you so much for that. Let's talk about the Eagles of the Empire series, because I was there. I used to be a salesperson at Headline when your first book in the series came out, Under the Eagle, which was 2000, I think.
Yeah.
And this is the 21st novel in the series, Death to the Emperor. And what must be so wonderful about this for you is I was doing some research. I was looking at blogger reviews, and there was a blogger who had read the 21st book. They said, "I've not read any of the others, and I loved it. And I got straight into it, and I want to read the rest." Now, after 21 novels in the series, for a reader to come to the series completely cold and to feel, completely at home with it and not feel like they're missing out on anything, and then to go back and read the others, there must be a knack to that. How do you do that? Tell us, Simon. Tell us.
Well, as a midwife to the process, you'll be in on the ground on this one. But we both know Marion Donaldson, my editor, and she's always said, "Look, whatever you write, you have to make sure that somebody can come in from the cold, pick it up, and read it, and they'll enjoy it for the book they're reading. But at the same time, hopefully, we'll get them to buy into the whole Macro and Cato universe." And it's like anything, isn't it? If you follow a series and you become familiar with the central characters and so on, you begin to care about them. And I think there's always a really terrific payoff when you discover a series for the first time, wherever you sort of slot into it and start reading it from the beginning. It happened with me for Hornblower. The first book I read was actually the first one he wrote, which was The Happy Return. And then he sort of went back and did the pre-start novels, and then the stuff that happened later in Hornblower's career. But following a character across a series of books, is a very, very rich and rewarding experience, particularly if the characters grow. If they are the same from book to book. I mean, no disrespect to Lee Child, but Jack Reacher is Jack Reacher is Jack Reacher. And with Macro and Cato, there's the point at which Cato suddenly gets promoted over the top of Macro. And, how do you deal with that new dynamic? And these are things we're familiar with. I mean, when I was teaching, there was a student of mine who was really, really good. And then when I left the college I was teaching at, he took over the department, and I went back to see him a year later. And he was a hell of a lot better than I was. And it was a real interesting moment, where very bittersweet, where I thought, I'm really proud of his achievements, but at the same time, I feel humbled that he's actually taken it much further than I did. And I think, so then that sort of fuels Macro's relationship with Cato, when he kind of thinks, here's the guy I raised up from a squaddy, and now he's my superior officer. How do I kind of relate to that? And, so I think if you kind of layer in these personal moments in your life, which I think are common to a lot of people, into the narrative, then these are people you grow with. And, 21 books into the series, 21 years of writing this, anybody who's kind of following the series is now as invested in Macro and Cato as I am. And every time I sit down to write a book, and I had no idea it was going to be 21 novels, I thought a dozen at best. It's like going on holiday with old buddies, really. And I'm an amanuensis, and they get up to shit, and I'm saying, slow down, I've got to get this down on the board. And it's like, you're sitting there at the fireside with them when they're doing their banter, and when that happens, it's that thing about, Robert Frost says again, you've got to feel for your characters, you've got to feel with them. And you've got to, have their fears, their ambitions, their emotions and stuff. And if you can do that, and it's quite moving sometimes, because they'll do stuff and you think, oh, blimey, that's pretty horrific. And if it shocks you, then there's a good chance it'll shock the reader, and they'll go along with it as well. So, yeah, I mean, 21 books. I don't see it ending anytime soon.
Very good. Very, very good. Now, were there any I read somewhere you said you envisioned your readers. You had a very clear idea of who your readers were as the bored people from the City of London on the train home.
Yeah.
Is that
or on to work.
or going to work? Yeah, that the kind of. Tell us where that come from, because so often we write for ourselves, I think, but very few of us take the time to imagine what our readers are going to be like. Where did that come from, and how did that help you write the books?
I was thinking about my father, actually, because he used to work in the city, and he went up down from Harlow to London every day, and he was always, reading a book on the train and reading there to and fro. And he said that sometimes they would be chatting with some people he knew on the train as well, but mostly he'd be reading. And I remember talking to him about it. And I said, well, how can you do that? How can you concentrate when you're on a train and there are other people and it's all a bit sort of noisy and all this? And he said, because it would drive me mad if I didn't have something to escape into, to be in a different place from, where I was. If I just sat there and looked at the same houses going past every day, the same people in the carriage, it would drive me insane. So I need something else. So I thought, yeah, no, I get that. And, this is one of the things I hear a lot from the readers is that, for example, a lot of the guys were in Afghanistan, in appalling kind of temperature and discomfort and things and so on, and danger. And they needed something, to escape from. Ironically, they chose to sort of, swap Afghan for a war zone in ancient Rome. But, I don't know how much that's escapism, but it's that thing about needing a space away from where you are, I think, and that's how I kind of envisage it, and that's why I go to a lot of effort to go to the places where the book is set to get some sense of what the quality of the light is, the sounds, the smells, the feel of a place, just so that I can transport the reader to it, when I get round to writing the book. And a lot of people say that, they feel that it's very kind of cinematic in the head.
Yes.
And, that's kind of, the game plan, really.
I'd like to come back to your research in just a second, but coming back to Under the Eagle, the first book, were there any sort of full starts when you began writing? Because I have to say you made my job very easy. It was an easy book to sell. It felt fully formed. It felt, it was brilliantly written. It was really, really good page turning stuff. But did it arrive like that? I mean, obviously it didn't. How did you come to write Under the Eagle? Were there full starts before that? Were there dead end alleys that you went down? How did it come about?
No, the actual first draft was very straightforward because I had written 3 previous novels with a very kind of cynical view of looking at what was selling in the shops and then doing something similar. And then, as I mentioned before, I was a big fan of the Hornblower series, and then Sharp was coming along, and I thought I really kind of like following these guys through these experiences. And I thought, but what I want to read about is ancient Rome. And of course, nobody was doing that at the time. The nearest to it was Lindsay Davis's Falco novels, yes, where she did a sort of worm's eye view of Roman society. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do from a military perspective. And I thought, well, and I didn't, think about writing it. I was looking for a book to read, and there wasn't anything.
Right.
So I thought, well, I'll write what I want to read. So, and this is why I say, you can't overplan these things. You have to feel there's an authenticity in the story that you're telling, and an authenticity in why you want to tell it. You can't just do it because you're looking at your bank balance. You have to do it because you're passionate about it. So that's how I got started on that, and wrote the first draft pretty quickly. Unfortunately, it was 150,000 words long, and my first agent said, "You're going to have to lose 50,000 before I submit it to headline." And I thought, well, you're kidding, a third of the novel. I mean, but this is brilliant stuff. And Wendy Suffield, who's the first agent, said, yeah, but you're going to have to lose 50,000 words. No two ways about it. Get to it. And it was a real liberation because I was going through it. There were whole chunks. There were scenes. There were storylines. There were characters who all sort of kicked out. And I was heartbroken, to lose this material. But when I looked at what was left at the end, I thought, wow, this is pretty mean. It moves along at a fair old pace, and doesn't feel like there's much fat here, and bless you, Wendy Suffield, for teaching me to edit, frankly.
Did that affect how you wrote the following books as well? Were they just as lean in their early drafts, or do you overwrite and then cut back?
I think as you go further into a series, and as my understanding of how Marion operates becomes more sophisticated, you begin to sort of write with her leaning over your shoulder, virtually, as it were. So as I'm writing, I'm thinking, if there's any kind of hesitation, I think, okay, so what would Marion's take on this be? And it's not kind of writing to order. There's a reason why she's been a successful editor for as long as she has. She's good at her job. And one of the things that it's been quite funny over the years is when she sends her editorial feedback, my first reaction is outrage, and then I sort of go, well, she's half right. And then I have a cup of tea and a biscuit. And then I go, oh, maybe 75%. And the next morning, it's kind of 90%. And typically, I say, Marion is about 95% right, and there's a reason, as I said, for that. And now it's, I'm in pretty good place in order to sort of second guess her on and it's useful, actually, to have that kind of interior dialogue going when you're writing, because it saves time. And also that question you asked earlier, if you go over the top, because you could do, and you're thinking, well, okay, this is a very kind of unpleasant and difficult scene. How would somebody else react to this? So you think about that, and you think, okay, well, does that require any kind of change then? Because I've read some pretty grim stuff in my time, crime novels and horror novels, and you think, I really didn't need to know that detail. And it hasn't improved the book knowing it. And some of this stuff is the stuff of nightmares, frankly. And you just, is it important to put it in there? I think sometimes trust the reader. They don't need it, painted in unsparing detail. It's like that movie Alien. I noticed you got your Star Wars figurine on the background.
Yes,
so we can talk science fiction.
We can.
The beauty of Alien was that you didn't get to see the guy in the rubber suit until right at the end, and you had no idea what shape it was, throughout the movie. And I think that's what's far more frightening than the guy in the rubber suit.
Yeah.
So and it's the same thing in books. You don't want to sort of like plaster all the details there and leave the reader nothing to do, because I think they probably they may reject it, and B, they'll probably feel a little bit insulted that you haven't trusted them to come up with the goods themselves.
There's a lovely Billy Wilder quote, which he said, if you let the audience add 2 + 2, they'll love you forever. And I think that's, trust the reader is, and I think you've said in the past as well, I was looking at my notes, I think you said when you're writing, you're enjoying it vicariously for the reader. So does that come back to that Robert Frost thing as well, about delighting the reader?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, because we're all readers as well as writers, and you'll imagine something in a particular way as you're writing it, but when you read back over it, it does come across sometimes as different from the way you intended it when you wrote it. And I thought that's quite an interesting moment when that happens, because you think, so this is what the reader's going to experience. And sometimes you think, well, we can tweak that and make it even better. And sometimes you think, well, maybe we shouldn't put that bit in. But it's an interesting, I'm not a great fan of rereading my own writing, to be honest, because it's always a work in process when it gets published. So that's how I regard it. I don't think there's such a thing as a finished novel. There's a novel every novel I think is at least 1 or 2 edits short of where it should be. And no novel will ever be edited, to perfection. And I think, because of that, when you reread stuff, it's actually quite painful, because the 130,000 words that the reader gets when the novel comes out are only the end point of a whole series of choices and possibilities and directions the story would have gone, all of which I've got up here.
Yeah.
And sometimes you think, well, wouldn't it have been better if it went that way?
Yeah.
Or, I'm not actually convinced by this now. This sort of, even though the readers go, oh, yeah, it's great,
Yeah.
because they don't see that process.
Yes, you know how the sausage is made, and it's
Sometimes you really don't want to know. I think having worked as a student in a chicken skinning factory, and knowing where chicken McNuggets come from, I can tell you.
You don't want to know. Yes, let's go back to your research, because you are steeped in research, particularly in Roman history. And I know you've been inspired by the writings of ancient Romans. Do you still need to go back and dig for details? Is it a constant process of research, or is there a point where you feel like, I kind of know this?
Well, I'll be honest with you here. The research is the best bit.
Right.
When you're traveling, seeing places, taking notes, reading books, talking to reenactors, all that sort of stuff is absolute magic. The problem is stopping it. And that usually happens at a point where Marion will call me and she'll say, Simon, that book you're handing in 2 months' time, how's it coming? And that's the point at which the research stops, actually. And I sort of settle down with industrial strength coffee and peanut butter sandwiches and get on with the job. Literally.
Peanut butter sandwiches, excellent.
Yeah, crunchy. Has to be crunchy. So it's, I mean, the research is very, very important. But I think the point at which I start writing is when I put it all to one side. And I don't refer to it as I'm writing, because the danger, if you kind of stop, go to the source, your research material, and then come back, is, the danger is you'll do an info dump. And that is also one of the more disappointing aspects of some historical fiction, is when somebody feels they have to give you a lecture on something. So I try to, my view on this is that, okay, I'll do all the research and I'll assume that the reader knows exactly what I do. And therefore you can just drop it in as it seems natural, in the course of a conversation or discussion of a particular place. But no more than that. And if they're interested, they'll either, if there's something they're not familiar with, they'll work it out from the context, or they'll go away if they're interested and look it up. In 90% of cases, I guess they just kind of go, oh, that's something I didn't know, I'll read on.
Yeah.
So, it's important, I think, not to take, to do those pauses where you take the reader out of the fiction and say, here's the lecture, now let's go back.
Yeah.
Because that really kind of destroys it. And it's a basic error I think a lot of people who start out in writing do. Somebody lent me a book they'd written recently. There were 70 pages of exposition before any dialogue. And, it's not that they hadn't done a very, very good job of world building. They had. And it's not that they couldn't write, but it's just that they didn't yet know that, all the world building and stuff is something you do before you sit down to write. And the key thing is the story and the characters, and I think that's a sort of bit of a tyro mistake that a lot of people make.
I think it comes back to what you're saying earlier again about trusting the reader. Trust the reader to put these things together. You mentioned reenactors. We were talking to Christian Cameron recently.
Oh, right. Okay.
And he, of course, he takes part in reenactments. He dresses up. He does it all. Ever done that, or any chance of you doing that, Simon?
No. I mean, I've got all the kit, and I have, you try it on sometimes just to see what the weight feels like, and what movements are possible, and how difficult it is to clean, all the sort of nuts and bolts and stuff like that. But that is all credit to Christian for finding the time to do it. But when I'm writing, 2.5 books a year, and I'm also dealing with moving from one country to another and things like that, then you don't have a huge amount of time left for anything else. So they're very, they're always interesting people to talk to, because they have hands-on experience of wearing the kit for several hours a day, and the discomforts that go with that. But also things that I went to Chester, where they're building a Roman auxiliary fort up at Chester, and there's a guy there who, some reenactors who had a Roman catapult. And I was really interested in the loading process. And then once they loaded it, everybody kind of backs away from this thing. And I said, well, what's going on? And guys, just get back. And I said, why? He said, because these things, the arms break every so often. And when they break, this thing flies round and it can kind of break ribs and stuff like that. The broken. So, I thought, blimey, there's something you don't know unless you've seen a catapult in action. So the very next book, of course, that gets fed into it. Well, because it's just something that, it's a bit, you have to move away from Hollywood where no uniform is ever grubby. Everything works flawlessly and everybody goes around in this kind of nice degrees of uniformity in terms of their dress. No, the Roman army didn't look like that. The British army and campaigning in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars didn't look like that. They looked like tramps in fairly short order. I think so. You need to kind of reflect that, and reenactors tend to be the best people to go to, for that sort of thing. And there's also a strand of historian as well, the late Peter Conley, who wrote this fantastic book, Greece and Rome at War. And he debunked, it's really, really interesting talking to him. He's a real grouchy old character, but so, on the ball. So there was this thing that you read when you're a kid that, the Roman javelins are designed to sort of go through a shield and then bend so nobody could throw the javelins back. You think, well, and this is one thing my, classics teacher told me, and I thought, that's really, really clever. And I was talking about this with Peter Conley. He said, well, of course, it's bollocks. He said, I spent 2 years making these javelins, trying to get them to do what the ancient sources said and throwing them at sheets of plywood. And he said, it can't happen. He said, I tried everything, but it doesn't work. And he said, the reason why they have that long, thin iron point, shaft behind the iron point, is to pierce the shield far enough to skewer the guy behind it. No other reason.
Right.
And you think, well, unless you do these things practically, sometimes the ancient sources aren't the most reliable. Sometimes these archaeologists and the reenactors try these things out. For example, everybody makes this mention about the marching yoke. And there's a guy called Derrick who's in the Ermine Street Guard who spent years trying to work out how the Romans could possibly fit all the kit they needed onto a marching yoke. And then have it arranged in such a way that if there was an emergency, they could get their kit on really, really quickly. And, he finally came up with a version of the yoke that could do all this. But, until he did, who knew?
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned earlier you do 2.5 books a year, which is extraordinary output, I think. And your website, I love your website because if you go to the website, rather than just list all your books, you have a surprise me button, which I love, where you just click randomly and it brings up 3 random books. I'm going to do it now. There we go. Okay, this is interesting. It's got two Eagles of the. It's got Eagles of the Empire, a Pirata book that you co-wrote with T.J. Andrews, Playing with Death that you co-wrote with Lee Francis. You've co-written a lot of books as well. How did that come about?
Well, it started with Tim actually, and it was a headline marketing idea. Somebody said, wouldn't it be really good if we did this sort of like a serious thing with a end of boss level at the end of each novel and then the big boss at the end. And it was sort of as crass as that. And then I sat down with Tim and we started talking about it and we thought, well, this could be a lot better than this. And we've worked on we're working on our 4th novel now, which is, I think, one of our best. I think it's the best of the things I've written with Tim. But also, I think it stands up pretty well in terms of the whole thing because it's about Caratacus. So it's the whole thing, redone from the British perspective, the ancient Britain's perspective of the invasion of Britain. And we're having a huge amount of fun with that because it's Caratacus in Rome at the end of his career, defeated and telling his story to a Roman historian who knows he's going to have to make it fit Roman expectations. And at the same time, wanting to, so it's that thing with history. There's a story you want to tell. There's a story that emerges from the facts and the interviews, and there's a story that you can get away with. Right. That's kind of how history works. So we're having a lot of fun with that. Lee was actually one of my former students, and we planned out this television series, and we've got a producer attached. But you know how these things go, it takes forever for anything to happen. Yeah. And I said to Lee, look, we might as well write it as a novel whilst we're waiting for the TV deal. And I said, and if we do it as a novel, then we can sell the rights to the novel. We've also got 4 seasons of 10 episodes for each season, plotted out, and we could probably get a gig writing some of the scripts. So potentially we could get paid 3 times for this.
Yes.
So that's how we sort of got round to writing that.
And do you enjoy? You clearly enjoy the co-writing process. Are you exercising different muscles from when you're working alone?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating in the differences, because I love being kind of locked away with Macro and Cato or Horst Schenker, and their world. That's really kind of immersive. But what's really nice about co-writing is it's not like both of us sit down at the same word processor and argue over who's going to hit the next key. It's not like that at all. I write the first, chunk of the book, say a fifth of the book or whatever, hand it over to Tim and Lee, when I was working with Lee, and then they will kind of change my bit, add the next chunk, and send it back.
Right.
And occasionally we will, meet up and discuss, issues to do with the plot or a particular character or anything we think needs more discussion between the two of us. And if you find it's a bit like marriage in a way. If you find the right partner, the conversation flows. Everything works really, really nicely. And Tim will say something, and I go, "Wow, that's brilliant! We've got to have that in." And then because he said that, I think, and that would mean that this, and he goes, "Yes." And then of course, there are the moments where you go, "But that doesn't work." So you have these kind of, but it's really good. And, I couldn't do both exclusively. I couldn't just be a co-writer, and I couldn't just be well, I suppose I could. I did it for long enough. But, I enjoy both processes. And it's like, as as we talked about earlier, writing's half the process, reading's half the process. But even within the writing side of it, there's the editor involved, there's publicity, there's marketing, there's legal bods, there's all sorts of things. So, I think on balance, things are much, much richer because there is this kind of collegiate approach to the whole process. And this idea that, the writer is the be all and end all of the book, is something I don't think is terribly helpful. And you do meet writers who believe that and think they are kind of geniuses and those kind of people are best avoided at parties because they will talk about themselves.
I've met a few. Yes. Simon, this has been absolutely brilliant. So what's coming in the future? Are we seeing more Berlin wartime thrillers, and we'll definitely be seeing more Eagles of the Empire? Is there anything else coming that we should be looking out for?
Yeah. Well, I'm starting writing a musical, which is
wow.
Yeah, I mean, all the music's been done, unfortunately, but it's just it's for because we moved recently to Mauritius, and my wife is back with a band that she sang with in Geneva 20 odd years ago. They've retired there as well, so they're now gigging together and so on. And this is an interesting band because they had the first ever image, the first ever pop video on the internet, and the reason for that is because the guy who ran the band was working at CERN, where Tim Berners-Lee was working,
right?
When he was designing the internet. And he came, into Savannah's office one day and said, "Look, I need an image and I need a video to test this new thing out." And so well, here. And so they became the first things on the internet.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a really interesting story there. And it's but there's the human things, of course, about the band across the years. But the reason why I think that there's a sort of a possibility of making this interesting is because of that particular history.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that. Folks, Simon's got one or two books that you can catch up with there. So, I would say Death to the Emperor is as good a place to start as any, and Blackout and Dead of Night as well. So do check those out. Simon Scarrow, thank you so much for speaking to me today. It's been a real pleasure. Hope to speak to you again soon.
Mark. Good to see you again after all these years.
What are your writing dreams? Finishing that book, quitting the day job, becoming a best-selling author? Well, over 4 years, we've studied the advice of over 300 best-selling authors who've collectively sold over 500 million books. And we are excited to announce the Bestseller Academy. If you're ready to take your writing to the next level with accountability, craft, and coaching, your bestseller dreams are now only a click away. To find out more and apply, visit bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. That's bestsellerexperiment.com/academy.
Whoa, how about that? That was an amazing interview, Mark.
He's great. I could have chatted to him for a lot longer as well. He's one of those guys who absolutely fascinating. And if you watch the YouTube version, you'll see in his office there's just props everywhere, bits of weapons and uniform and helmets and all kinds of stuff as well. So yeah, he's an absolutely fascinating guy.
I've only got one sad little Greek helmet in my study.
Yeah, well, haven't we all? Let's talk. The thing that really jumped out at me first of all was this idea of him visualizing the reader as the bored commuter on the train home, which I thought was just it's something that we say don't write to market, but and you should write the book that you really, really want to write. But once you've done that, having an idea of who is going to read it is really going to help you hone the edit, isn't it? Is this something that you do, Julian?
Yeah, it's something that what really struck me is he's writing the kind of book that he wanted to read. That at the time, Roman kind of military historical fiction wasn't really a thing. It was very much focused on things like I, Claudius, the emperors, memoirs of Hadrian, often quite kind of highfalutin, intellectualizing books, but he really got into the nitty-gritty of life in the legions. But he didn't necessarily do it because he thought it would, he thought it would sell, otherwise why would you? But it was the kind of book that he wanted to read. And I guess to me it really shows, if you are passionate about something, if you want something, other people will want it too.
Yeah.
He understands his reader because he is that reader.
Yeah. Or at least his dad was, talking about his dad being the bored commuter on the train home. And when it came to selling the book in, and I didn't really want to go into this too much with Simon, because I thought he might be appalled with how I sold the book in, because it was, I have to say, the easiest sell of that year. I remember it very, very clearly because it had this wonderful cover, sort of sandy cover with a map and a sword and kind of Roman stuff on there. And I would go into bookshops because I was a sales rep. I'd be driving all over the southeast of England, and I'd go into bookshops and we had our little kit where we sold things in. It was one of our lead titles. We were all very, very excited about it. And normally with a lead title, you would sit down, you go into the plot, and you go into this, and you go into that, and the reasons why they should buy it, and this, that, and the other. And I would say, this is the year 2000, and I would say to people, you saw Gladiator? And they'd nod. And I'd say, the opening 20 minutes? And they'd nod. I'd say, it's that. It's that in book form, and it's a series that's going to run and run. And they go, sold. And they buy. Back then, we had what were called dump bins, which were these cardboard structures that you put at the front of the shop where you had 24 or 36 copies of the book. And they go, yeah, give me a bin. And it was just the easiest. And that's because I think he was thinking of that reader. He was thinking of, the kind of people who had seen Gladiator. And as you say, there was a huge gap in the market as well. People weren't writing books like this necessarily. And it just slotted into place and sold like the gangbusters. And here we are, 21 books later, and he's still going strong.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. What really amazes me too is how long the series has been going for. How many books did you say?
It's 21 novels. And
21 novels. Fantastic.
Yeah. And this is the thing, how do you keep readers coming back for more? It's and it's interesting. He made the connection with Jack Reacher. I mean, the Jack Reacher books are still going strong, but the character of Jack Reacher pretty much stays the same. It's the environment with Jack. Jack goes to a new town. There are new villains to overcome. And that's what Jack Reacher does, and then he moves on to the next town. That's the model that works. Whereas with these, he was saying that with each one of these books, the characters do grow and evolve and change. And in this 21st novel, they're going to be different to the people they were in the first novel. But but doing it in such an incremental way that you can still come in with each new novel.
Yeah. And that takes a real skill. And a real artistry to do that, I think. I think he kind of baked it into the premise in a way, because he focuses so intensely on the characters and their relationships to each other. He must know these characters like the back of his hand.
Yeah.
Or perhaps better.
Yeah, it's interesting that idea of baking it into the premise, in that they must... What we talked about, surprising himself and surprising the reader and keeping the reader engaged and that kind of thing. And we're going to talk more about the reader in the extended edition. But this idea that you give them room for growth to start with, I think that's, if you're writing something and it's book one in a series, you've got to give them somewhere to go. You've got to, and I was very, very aware of this with the Witches of Woodville series, that I couldn't have Faye as a fully fledged witch with all her powers and everything go. And also emotionally, she's quite, a common criticism of the Crowfolk is that she's quite immature. And there was an intent behind that, because she needed to grow up. She'd been quite naive and quite shielded and hadn't, not very worldly. So by the time, I've just delivered the fourth book to my editor. And
well done.
Thanks. She's, and she's, grown up considerably from the first book. In fact, one character makes a mention of it. So yeah, I think if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I've got an idea for a series that could potentially, at least, 3 books, 4 books, 5 books or whatever, will run. I think it is important to give characters somewhere to go. You've written trilogies and series. How are you aware of that when you're sitting down to write for the first time?
Oh yeah. I'm working on something at the moment, which is basically the premise is designed to run and run. And essentially the main character will go on a very lengthy journey, but each story is still self-contained. It's a little bit like the Jack Reacher series, where, character does sort of go from town to town encountering different villains. And yet I don't want the character to be the same person at the end that they were at the beginning.
Yeah.
I want to reward readers for sticking with the series. And that's something I am very mindful of, while also trying to make each book a self-contained adventure that you can pick up without having to do a bunch of homework beforehand.
Yeah.
That's what spooks me about very long series, to be honest.
Yeah. It's I'm going through exactly the same thing, and each of my adventures, each of the Woodville books, I want to be a standalone story. I want you to be able to pick them up, and where there is some kind of back history, you usually just need a couple of lines to acknowledge it. Someone will mention it, and the cheapest version of that is when you used to read Marvel comics, and Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus would say something, and it would be in an issue that you've not read, and there'd be a little box. It would say, "See issue 261, Ed," and you think, "Oh, okay, I should really get." Now we can't do that in novels, not as literally anyway. But you can kind of go, "Well, all that business last year with so and so and the thing, let's put that behind us." So you can hint to the reader and go, "Oh, there's more to this. Oh, I can. There's a richer kind of history to this that I can," without making the reader feel cheated that they're not in on the joke or anything like that.
To sort of sidetrack slightly, it reminds me in television. I remember when sort of serialized television was hailed as the second coming. And people would talk about, "Oh no, it's not really a season of television. It's a 10-hour movie split up into 10 parts." Yeah. And it's rubbish, honestly. I hate that kind of television. I really like going on a journey with a character, of course, but splitting it up into chunks that are digestible and where each one stands on its own. I like shows like that. It's part of the reason why I think Star Trek Strange New Worlds has been so successful.
Yeah.
Compared to, say, Star Trek Picard has been very divisive, for example.
Each one of those episodes works on their own. One of the things they do tell you when you're working on a pitch for a TV show is write episode 1, the pilot, but also write episode 3, because that's where the show has momentum. That's where the show is already up and running. And frankly, it's where a lot of new viewers might casually wander in and go, okay, what's this about? Oh, I see. It's about these people in a spaceship going from planet to planet, discovering new worlds. Oh, that sounds cool. I might go back to the beginning. I might continue watching it from here. So that's quite a tricky thing to pull off. And I'm aware that, people who might pick up the third of my books should be able to pick it up and go, what's this about? Oh, it's about witches and it's the war. Oh, and there's more of them. Let's go back and start. I remember picking up just randomly, because I'd never read him before, picking up a Bernard Cornwell novel from the library. And it was one of his Uther ones, the series that he did. And I only found out later it was book 5 in the series. But I totally, there was there's roster of characters at the beginning. There are some maps. There's a little bit of context, and you're off. And I think Simon's books are exactly the same. Whereas you can just go, okay, these guys, these Roman soldiers, it's just another day for them. There's a new challenge to face. There's new things to conquer. It's. I think you've got to be. Whereas in a trilogy is very much a beginning, middle, and an end.
Yep.
But even so, those should still work as their own kind of story. You don't want the second book ending on too much of a cliffhanger, especially if you've got to wait 18 months between books. But you've read a trilogy.
With Ashes of Olympus, I kind of approached it so that each one had a very distinct tone and feel to it. So the first one is very much an adventure story. The second one, The Ivory Gate, is very much a tragedy. It's a character-driven romantic tragedy, actually. The third one is a war movie. It's a war story. But what amazes me is people being able to pick up the third one and just read it without having read the first two. And I kind of sit there going, how on earth are you doing that? But apparently they like it.
Yeah, that's a good sign. That is a good sign. Yeah. We can talk about trusting the reader in the extended version as well. We'll come back to that in a minute. I was also really interesting to this thing of getting paid 3 times for his work as well.
I knew you were going to raise that.
We're in a time where certainly in the UK, authors' earnings are really, really down. But there are opportunities. You get paid for the novel, you get paid for rights, and if you're lucky, you might get paid for the screenwriting rights as well. So it's. But he had a script idea which he'd co-written, and then decided, what, let's turn this into a novel, because movie making, TV making can be incredibly slow. So if you haven't sold it yet, then do go back and consider writing it as a novel. It's something I've done. Hasn't quite worked yet in terms of selling the rights and then getting something made, but it's certainly been on my mind.
Look, no writing is wasted. And as long as you keep writing, sooner or later you'll find somewhere for it to land. That's just kind of my philosophy.
I'm really glad you said that, because there are a couple of things I'm working on at the moment where I am thinking, God, am I wasting my time? Is this actually going anywhere? Is this going to land anywhere? But you're right, because even if it doesn't make it onto the screen or into a book, you have learned something on the way about yourself and learned something about the craft. Because there will be novels that I've got loads of scripts and novels and stories that haven't seen the light of day, may never see the light of day. And I know when you're starting out, it's difficult to hear that, but it's the truth. I mean, has that been the case for you, Julian? Have you got stuff that's never seen the light of day?
There are things that will never see the light of day. Actually, it's interesting, connection to Simon. The very first novel I wrote was a werewolf story in Roman Britain.
Wow. Sold.
Yeah. Look, I love the premise. I still love the premise. and I will come back to it one day, but it was the novel where I was learning to write, and guess what? It's complete dreck. I think that if I was going to tackle it again, I would need to start from scratch.
Right.
Basically.
Yeah. I've got a few.
Yeah. And look, I've written screenplays. I've written pitches for TV shows. I even directed a short film once as a kind of a sample to kind of entice producers. And everybody looked at it and went, well, we love it. You're an excellent writer. We have no idea how to sell this.
Yep, I have that as well.
Yeah. I am just kind of looking at that script, and the story won't go away. And I'm thinking of redeveloping it into a novel. It's an idea, at least.
I mean, this is the thing. The idea of a werewolf in Roman Britain, really exciting, very exciting. But there is, particularly when you're starting out as a writer, I think there's too much weight given to the idea. I've got an idea. This is an amazing idea, but so much of it is about the execution. We on the podcast recently, we were talking about digging out old stories that never, and Mr. D was quite keen to see some of my old dirty laundry. I did find a screenplay from about 20 years ago. I had a sort of time travel idea where we had dinosaurs rampaging through the streets of London, and it was very Doctor Who, actually.
I was just thinking of that.
Yeah, and it was, there were great ideas, but it just didn't hang together as a story. There wasn't anything in that there was no. The characters were cardboard. The themes were really thin, but it had some cool dinosaurs and and other stuff, and that had Roman soldiers actually marching through the streets of modern London. So there were images, there were flashes, exactly. But why not? Is because there was no bloody story. That's why it just didn't work. So it's ideas are a kind of a dime a dozen, but it's so much of it's to do with the execution, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I sort of come to the conclusion that all ideas are worthless. It's just that some ideas are more worthless than others.
Well, look, let's talk some more about stuff in the extended edition. We're going to talk in the extended edition about overplanning, reading as a creative act, research and reenactment, and working with editors. And look, if you're listening to this and thinking, hang on, I want to listen to the extended edition. Well, the extended edition is for our sponsors. It's the people who keep this show going. It's our academates in the Bestseller Academy, and it's our patrons on Patreon. And we simply could not keep the show going without beautiful people like you. And now, what do you get when you support us on Patreon? Well, if you become a chart topper supporter, you get access to over 120 deep dive and special episodes and subjects like blog tours, writer burnout, TikTok editing, copy editing, screenwriting, book launches, writing sex scenes, that's a good one, networking, well building, YouTube, much, much more. We speak to experts in their field, including agents and publishers, and all that stuff is there for you to access at any time as a chart topper supporter on Patreon. So just in the last couple of weeks, we've had deep dives. There's one with myself and director John Wright. We're talking about the development of our film Unwelcome. We've got a great episode with Jack Renenson from the new Bookerchill fantasy science fiction imprint Second Sky. He's talking about what their editors are looking for, how to submit to them, pitching, all that good stuff. So if you want to find out more about that, go to bestsellerexperiment.com/support, become a chart topper supporter on Patreon, or sign up to the Academy. If you sign up to the Academy, you get to join the most supportive community in writing. You get me and Mr. D as your coaches. Mr. D does writing, life coaching, and I focus on craft. There's loads of courses to help you become a better writer. I have a weekly writing surgery on Zoom. You can have one-to-one sessions with me, and you get all those deep dives, which we have a special app for that. You can dip into them anytime. So to find out more about that, go to academy.bestsellerexperiment.com. There's links in the show notes for you to find those. Okay, welcome to the extended edition. Now, I was fascinated by this idea of over-planning because sort of planning versus over-planning. I think it's important to make the distinction between the two. and long-time listeners will know about the 50,000 word, outline that me and Mr. D wrote.
50,000 words.
Yeah, all right, give it a rest. That me and Mr. D wrote for Back to Reality, and I was a massive over planner. I did try and map the route out in as much detail as possible, but then you rob yourself of the surprise. And so, how was that something you've ever done, Julian? Over planning, is it something you've ever been guilty of, or have you always sort of gone by the seat of your pants? How's it work for you?
I think that early on I did try to overplan. I think that it doesn't help that a lot of the early how to write books that I read were about screenplays rather than novels. But that said, I think that actually put me in good stead in some ways, because it got me thinking about structure in a way that I've always found very helpful. I've kind of landed in a bit of a happy place in that I kind of have a very broad idea of where the story's going and where it's going to end. But I kind of break it into three chunks, if you like, almost a 3-act structure. Each of those acts, though, has 3 acts and actually almost stands up as a little novella in itself. And so by the time that the novel's finished, it's actually 3 novellas stitched together. I tried serializing the novellas with the Tooth and Blade series and failed spectacularly, so I'm going to stick with just having the bigger books. But I find that really useful as a way of kind of chunking it down, because I don't know about you, but I want to run screaming in terror from the room when I think about the idea of writing a book. But the idea of writing, just moving the story forward incrementally towards a milestone, is somewhat more manageable. As far as planning goes, I guess the way that I've kind of figured it out is having sort of a 1 or 2 line summary for each each chapter, deciding from the outset whose chapter it is, who is the viewpoint character. But to be honest, when I'm in the zone, I just focus on writing the best scene that I can, and I don't worry too much about the bigger structure of it. So I think that I've kind of got the best of both worlds in that I've got a really clear sense of where the story's going, but there's still enough room to find that surprise and delight, and sometimes to find that, actually, that's a really good place for a chapter break, and perhaps a shift in viewpoint. And as long as the characters still surprise and delight you, I think that they'll surprise and delight the readers.
Yeah, and that's the knack, isn't it? Like you, I became obsessed with structure because I came to writing through screenwriting and reading, this kind of hero's journey. And funny enough, listeners, Julian and I did a little trilogy of deep dives on the hero's journey, which were recorded a long time ago. So I'd be interested to go back and listen and see if I still agree with myself on that, because I've kind of, I mean, one of the problems I find the hero's journey, I think it's important to learn about structure. And certainly if you're writing in that kind of Western monomyth kind of thing, which a lot of us are, learning why those story beats elicit the kind of reactions that they do and why they work. But the problem with a lot of those screenwriting analyses and, story shapes and circles and trapezoids and everything is they all come after the fact. They're written by people who look at a story and go, oh, okay, look at the shape of this. These things happen at this point. Whereas I think the writer working at it in the moment isn't aware of that.
No. It's interesting you say that, because I kind of moved on a bit from the hero's journey. Ironically, from writing a book about classical myth. Because guess what? Most of the actual myths, most of the actual ancient epics don't fit the hero's journey paradigm very closely. Joseph Campbell, God bless him, but he did kind of twist things in a very specific way and read them in a very specific way. And sometimes I think kind of corrupted the intention behind what is actually in the stories. He also is very keen on this idea that all of these stories, it's universally true. It's very much a matter of, this is just my view, having a premise and forming a conclusion before you've got your evidence, and then madly scrambling to try and make the evidence fit.
Yeah.
But I've kind of moved on to psychology, honestly. I want my character to be a different person by the end.
Yeah.
That they were, well, they're still the same person, but they've learned something.
Yeah.
And even if things don't necessarily have a happily ever after, we know that they've gone on a journey spiritually, psychologically, mentally, and that can actually be very difficult to serialize sometimes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. For me, I've pretty much abandoned any planning now. I tend to have an eye, particularly when I'm working on the Woodville books, because I will sit down and think about how I want Faye to change. That's usually the first question I ask myself. How do I want my protagonist to be different by the end of this story? And often, sometimes it's just a minor difference. It's just a little thing that's changed, but it takes her a lot of challenges to get there. But it does need to be, a change. Something needs to, and so I start thinking about what I can challenge her with, and that comes in the form of an antagonist who will represent some kind of antithesis to Faye. And you and I, we're both fans of the Script Notes podcast. We're there's listeners. I'll put a link in the show notes to a clip on YouTube where Craig Mazin, who's wrote Chernobyl and The Last of Us, the TV show that's stunning people at the moment, he gives a kind of a lecture on the central dramatic argument, and it was a road to Damascus moment for me. I was like, oh wow, this is how I write now.
Yeah, I heard the same thing, and I found it very interesting how much he draws on Aristotle's Poetics as well, and I'm like, oh, my classical education is vindicated at last. But it was a real eye opener, because I think unconsciously I had been kind of doing what he was talking about, but to have it articulated by someone who's a lot smarter than me, so clearly. He articulates it so clearly, and to be able to do it really intentionally is really good. Like you, I kind of start with a question now, sometimes it can actually be a really deep, broad question, and I have this problem that I want to ask deep, broad questions in children's books.
Yeah, why not?
So the question on one of the several things I'm working on at the moment is, if someone that you loved developed a disability, could you stick with them? Would you stick with them?
Right.
We all want to say yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
then you've got to test it.
We got to test that. And the realization that sometimes that actually means that you have to change. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great one. That is a great, because a good question, like a good central dramatic argument like that, something very often you immediately go, well, yes, of course. And then you go, yeah, but would you? What if it meant that you had to sacrifice this? What if it meant that you had to give this up? What if it meant that you had to become a different person? Are you willing to do that? And you prod and you test and you test and you test until you take them to breaking point. And then that's the point where they either change or retreat. I mean, this for me is the joy of writing now, is torturing my protagonists with a simple idea. And I think the thing with the central dramatic argument, it's a good theme is that it needs to be debatable. You need to be able to sit down and go, well, actually, could we? Would we? Truthfully, could we really do that? And I think once you do that, you've got a compelling story that is thought-provoking as well.
Can you come up with a central dramatic argument that can sustain a series and can be explored in multiple different ways?
Right.
That's a question that I'm dealing with at the moment, and I don't mind telling people what the question that I'm dealing with is, because I know that everyone will come up with their own way of dealing with it, even if they do want to run with it. Is love stronger than hate?
Right.
That's what it comes down to, this next series.
Well, that's why I think, I mean, when you're writing a series, in TV, they talk about the endless well, the very opposite of what you were talking about earlier, where they say, oh, this is one story told over 10 episodes. Whereas a lot of producers love this idea of the endless well, where you can come back to something again and again and again. And if you have an idea like that, is love stronger than hate? You can come back and test that theory with different people, different situations each time. And that's great. You're really onto something there, if you're willing to write that 10, 12, 20 times.
I am. I certainly am, because it can be explored in so many different iterations, because love can take so many different forms and hate can take so many different forms. But I think that's something that Simon's actually got really down pat. He's got that endless well of story, that he's got these two characters who it's baked into the premise that they're going to be going off on adventures. Yeah. They're going to be exploring different parts of the empire, different even within Britain. Even within Roman Britain, there's so much variance geographically, but also their relationship to one another. I loved his story about his junior who got his kind of protege who got promoted above him.
Yes.
I've had that happen before.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have.
Yeah,
very relatable.
Yeah, it was. It made things weird, I can tell you that.
Let's talk about reading as a creative act. This idea, and this is something you discover, I think, really when you've published something and you start getting feedback from readers, where they will come back and talk about the things that you wrote that are very, very personal to you, but seeing it through their eyes, and now it means something almost completely different to them. And it's it can be baffling the first time it happens, because sometimes you want to correct them, say, no, that's not what I meant. But you have to go, no, fine. If that's what it means to you, great. Have you had those moments?
Yeah, I have actually. And what I find is I have to kind of sit back and just let it happen, because what I've done is put marks on the page, transmitting language in my head onto a page in a way that kind of transmits the story into the reader's brain. And that's where it comes to life. The story doesn't live on the page. It lives inside the reader's mind. You want the story to come alive in the reader's head. You have to trust the reader to make that to be able to do that. And this is why some stories land for some people, and some people's stories just don't. It's because their brains work different ways, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I I've just come back from an academic conference about Tolkien, actually, and one of the big themes was adaptation, particularly of the Rings of Power. But one of the conclusions that kind of came out of the discussion was very much adaptation is how storytelling works.
Right.
That what ends up going on the page and going into the completed book is an adaptation of a story that's playing in the author's mind. They need to adapt that into language. Then it gets adapted into a physical medium. The book is a physical object, or an electronic file, if you will. That gets adapted yet again when the reader reads it and creates meaning.
Yeah. This is why people get so upset when they watch a TV version of their favourite book and they go, well, that's not how I saw it in my brain. And it's like, well, no one else would have seen it the way that you see it in your brain. Each one of us would have had our own different interpretation of it, our own different adaptation of it in our head.
Correct. And TV is so different, and films are so different from books, because reading is often such a private activity. Whereas in a TV show, you're experiencing it en masse. You have to share with others, and that can actually be really confronting. But one of the things that I think distinguishes the real seasoned writer from the beginner writer is that the more seasoned writer knows when to pull back, and knows when they need to let the reader infer what's going on. When they can make the story come alive in their head, with what they don't say as much as what they do. Yeah. For me, like a lot of what I do as an editor, like I run a freelance editing company.
He's very good.
And thank you. A lot of what I do is actually, if there's a theme that's there that I think that the author's not aware of, I try to make them aware of it and say, is this intentional? Do you want to bring this out more? But also pruning it back just that little bit, if it's to avoid over-explaining. And also using white space on the page, I think, is the secret sauce that doesn't get talked about very much. Knowing when to put line breaks in to escalate the tension just that tiny little bit. I really love playing with white space on a page and trying to make the page look aesthetically pleasing almost. Of course, it's going to wind up different when it's actually printed, but those line breaks will be there, and you've got a reasonable facsimile.
Those hard line breaks are all important. I play with those all the time, where you're giving the scene rhythm, particularly with, and it's not just dialogue either. It's where you have breaks in the action. It might be because of my screenwriting, but I tend to think of these as cuts in the camera. You know, you're cutting from A to B, and then you're cutting across the room, and then you're getting close up on someone. And that, I find, can give real momentum and pace to the whole thing as well. The other thing is reactions. I love using white space to try and space out different characters' reactions to kind of highlight their own little moment. There's an old quote, I think that it was from Sidney Poitier, that acting is reacting. And if you want to make the story sort of come alive, you need to really highlight those reactions between the characters. They're so telling. But to bring it back to Simon, I think that his point about not beating the reader over the head with exposition is so strong and so powerful. Absolutely. It's it's an old Billy Wilder thing, which is if you allow the viewer to add 2 + 2, they'll love you forever. It increases engagement. They're leaning forward, trying to piece together what you're presenting them with. And it's not just exposition. It's little things like describing the character. I think one of the problems we have is when we study literature, we'll often study Dickens or Austen or something. Whereas the style then, because we weren't terribly worldly, if Dickens was describing a slum, he would spend 3 pages describing it. If Melville's describing, the Pequod, you basically get a training a manual of a whaling ship and how to, and there's a lot of technical stuff in there. Whereas now, your reader is a bit more worldly. They've got Google Images. They can look things up. They've seen a lot of TV and film. So you can infer things. You can give 2 or 3 little bits of description of a room or a character, and then they create something in their own mind. As we said, they're adapting it in their own mind, and they're doing the hard work, essentially. They're bringing themselves to it and creating a character, an environment, a moment in their mind that's theirs, and that increases engagement, and they're more likely to keep reading.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had this experience. I read From the Way Home, the first Ashes of Olympus book at this conference. It was bloody nerve-wracking. Reading to a conference room with about 50 people in it. But people were staring into space rather than making eye contact. And I honestly thought, oh God, I'm losing them. But when I finished, there was just this moment where almost collectively everyone just kind of went, oh. Right. And I had numerous people come up to me and say, I was there. I left the room. The trick to doing that, and we're getting back to the secret sauce, and it's something that Simon, I think, was getting towards, is sensory detail. Getting back to Aristotle again, it was Aristotle who first identified the 5 senses, and the realization that this is the way that we perceive reality. What you want to do is get the reader to live in the reality that you are constructing. And the way to do that is to feed them sensory information. That's the way to make the scene come alive rather than info dumping. Try to put as much of the world building and the construction of the universe that you're creating into the sensory descriptions. What do the characters see? What do they smell? Smell. Wow. Big one. Touch, sound, taste. If you can draw upon all of those things, they are items in your kit, you know? Yeah.
It's crucial. Well, that's a nice segue, actually. Let's go from that, because we're talking about research and reenactment next. And, we obviously had Christian Cameron on a few episodes ago talking about how he dresses up and reenacts. Simon was talking about the fact that he talks to reenactors. And of course, the problem is stopping it. You don't want the info dump. You don't want it to turn into a lecture. You have tons of historical detail in your novels, but it never slows it down. What have you found works really, really well when it comes to sort of filtering it into your story?
Focus on character. Remember that the detail that you put in and which details you choose to kind of linger on will be determined by your character. And the language choices that they use to describe their world will also make a big difference. I'm a big believer in viewpoint.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I love most is having 2 characters look at the same object and see different things.
Yeah.
So to give you an example, in one of my books, in the 3rd Ashes of Olympus book, The 7 Hills, the first third of the book is basically a battle scene with 2 characters on opposite sides of a battlefield getting closer and closer towards each other and kind of culminates in the moment where they finally confront one another face to face and see each other as human beings and realize, I don't want to kill you.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of generates the tension in the story. But what I found really fun was kind of alternating the chapters, and when one character sees a green banner, they look at the enemy's banner, it's green, and he thinks it's the fetid green of swamp water. The character on that side who are holding the green banners, they look at the green and they think it's the green of springtime.
Yeah.
That's the key to not getting bogged down, I think. Keep it in character, keep it in viewpoint, and keep the pace up. Don't linger too long on anything.
Yeah. And I think if you've got an object or you encounter something in an historical context, dramatize it. As Simon was talking about, was it a trebuchet or a catapult or something he was saying, and they all stood back from it because it would break and injure people? Then you dramatize that. Then you can show something that's historical and accurate and will feed the kind of the historical fiction fan, but you dramatize it as well. You're not just saying, look at this wonderful thing, because you might as well be in a museum. Where if it's actually doing something, then it's all the more fun. And
keep it moving. Keep it very kinetic. Don't have characters just kind of walking. Tell us how they're walking. Don't just say the character is sweaty. Tell them sweat was running down his face. I find that kinetic energy is another one of the secret ingredients. But also, I love his point about grit, about going into the nitty-gritty detail of trying to capture what life was really like, as opposed to this idealized version. The point about the muddy uniforms on the battlefield is a really strong one, which I hadn't really thought of before, to be honest.
Yeah.
But the point about reenactment and recreation is interesting too, because there are things that you can only learn by experiencing them. And I've mucked around with reenactment. It's a very expensive hobby. And not particularly compatible with Australia's climate, to be honest.
Right, yes.
But I have friends who are into it, and I've borrowed their gear to try it on. Had a very memorable afternoon shooting flaming arrows on a mate's property into a damp mound of lawnmower clippings. This was, I remember just thinking, oh God, if this turns into a bushfire, I can't wait to explain this.
Actually, talk about flaming arrows brings us back to Gladiator, because there are flaming arrows in the battle at the beginning of Gladiator, and I think a few historians said there's no evidence that the Romans did that, and Ridley Scott said, yeah, but there's no evidence that they didn't. So that's why he put it.
Yes, but that's a logical fallacy. You can't prove a negative.
Can't argue with Ridders. Listen, let's get on to the final bit here, which is about working with editors. Now, I just love this idea that cutting 50,000 words from his first novel was a real liberation, and that he's now thinking, because his editor Marion Donaldson, who was there at Headline when I was there, and she's still there now, a fantastic editor. He's now thinking, when he's writing, what would Marion's take on this be? And it's fascinating. We say don't write to market, but sometimes you write for a reader. Sometimes that reader might be your editor, which in this case works really, really well. Who are you thinking of when you're writing? Are you thinking of an editor, a reader, or just writing for yourself?
To be honest, at the moment, I'm just thinking, will this sell? God, Mark, I hope that a version of me doesn't live in your head.
You know what? It does. I got to say, it does. Whenever because when the last couple of stories in particular, because they're one of them was set in Roman Britain, and I was thinking, I've got to get this right for Julian. I've got to get this right for Julian. And of course, I didn't. You found numerous errors with my short story. Caesar, it's called Caesar on Watling Street. Not least that I put battle elephants into the story. And you said there's no evidence that they had them, and I said, well, there's no evidence that they didn't.
Well, see, the way that I kind of approach that kind of thing is I'll point out something that bumps me out of the story.
Yes.
Yeah. But I trust you to make the right decision, and I trust you to, as the storyteller, know your own story and your own voice. And I was actually fine with the elephants because A, it's a work of fiction, but also it fit with your voice. It fit with the story that you were telling. And I think that if it holds that kind of internal consistency and a feeling of authenticity, it's okay. I guess what? I have flaming arrows in the way home.
Yeah.
I deliberetely threw in anachronisms because I knew that I would have to stop and explain how things worked in the Bronze Age. Like one of the big things is coins. The characters use coinage, and that wasn't a thing until much, much later. But the reason I did that was it was intentional. I didn't want to have lengthy scenes of barter. I knew that would slow the story right down. Yeah, but I really think that trusting, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I think that I do think of you when I'm writing, because I think that we're on a very similar wavelength as storytellers, and that we think about story in a very similar kind of way in certain respects. But you're very good at selling the sizzle. That is to say, thinking about how to pitch the story to myself first, to get myself excited about it, to keep myself excited about it, and to kind of remember what drew me into the story in the first place. You're really good at pitching. And yeah, I do think about that. But I guess that what we've got here is, and I don't want this to turn into a love fest, but we've been working together for some years now, and I think that we've kind of developed a rapport that we trust each other. You read my stuff, I read your stuff, but Simon's got that with his agent as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, with his editor.
Editor, yeah. I think one of the most important lessons you learn as an editor as well is to understand the author's intent. Yeah. You don't try and foist your own intentions on their story. Why don't you tell this why don't you tell this story instead? I think it's important for you to identify what their intent is, and then try and nurture that. Then try and go, okay, you're maybe steering away from intent here, or is this what you really meant to do? And rather than try and impose something upon them.
And it takes a very certain kind of reader who can do that. To if you're adapting the story and making it come alive inside your head, what I'm really doing is trying to envision and be very sympathetic to the author's intentions and trust their voice, and understand that I kind of need to check my ego at the door here. And I might do things very differently sometimes. There have been a couple of occasions where I have actually said to authors, I don't think I'm the right editor for this book. Or alternatively, I don't think this book is ready for editing yet. and they actually generally really appreciate it when you say that. But I'm not in the business of telling people what they can and can't write.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right. Okay, over on social media, lots and lots of good news. And just this morning, on the day of recording, the Romantic Novelists Association of the UK, they announced their shortlist for their 2023 awards, and it's two of our members of the Bestseller Experiment family have been nominated. So we've got Jeevani Chirika and Lorna Cook. So Jeeve has been shortlisted for the Jane Wenham-Jones Award for Romantic Comedy for her novel Playing for Love, which is available now. And Lorna Cook has been nominated for the Historical Romantic Novel Award for her book The Dressmaker's Secret. I also know that Jenny Keogh, who's a listener, her novel The Legacy of Hailsham Hall is in the same category. So congrats to all of you. Absolutely amazing. Again, if you support the podcast, these are the kind of people you're going to be mingling with online. Just the absolute best. Lovely, lovely people. So congrats to you folks. Also on social media, I'll see if I can find a link to this that I can share with you as well. Kate Baker did a lovely unboxing video for her new novel Made of Steel, which I highly, highly recommend. It's lovely because you see the moment where she sees her book for the first time, and it really is quite something. It really is very, very sweet. I just had a lovely little note over on Patreon as well from Sasha Green talking about our episode with Cole Haddon, episode 424, a discussion about genre. She says, some really interesting discussion about genre in this one. I think when you're starting out as an author, it's much better just to write what you want and then work out what genre to market in. Obviously, once you've decided what genre suits you best, then you can write to that. But if you choose the wrong genre to start with, I think it can stunt your creativity. Also, and this fascinated me, regarding the discussion on chapter lengths and editing, dividing a book into chapters is the absolute last thing I do before a book goes out. So after all the editing is done, I find it saves me loads of time as I'm not having to rejig them all the time. Sasha, that's a brilliant idea. Have you ever tried anything like that?
No. Wow. I had not even occurred to me.
It's fantastic.
It is, yeah. I'm stealing that.
Yep, me too. Another bit of good news, again, for someone in the BXP group, GB Ralph, Gavin Ralph, who a new novel, Murder on Milverton Square. He's an author from New Zealand. Absolutely brilliant, sort of cozy crime. He's seen his book in a library. He's just been added to his local library in Palmerston North City Library. And it's a wonderful thing seeing your book in a library for the first time with that little sort of plastic wrapper around it and everything. It just feels there's something about it. Certainly, if like me, you were going to libraries a lot as a kid, that's such an important milestone in your journey. So congrats on that, Gavin. It's brilliant news. Have you seen your book in a library with that little plastic wrapper, Julian?
Oh, yes. I have. And I was just quietly got my pen out and went to sign it, and I heard this librarian, "What are you doing? You depraved man! Get the hell out of my library."
And last but by no means least, this is actually from a future guest on the podcast. I've recorded this interview already, and it is one of the strangest, one of the most wonderful interviews I've done. It's a very, very strange book. It's a book called Dear Mr. Popstar, where Dave Philpott, who isn't a real person, writes to pop stars like Nick Kershaw and points out the illogic in some of their pop lyrics. Anyway, he's got the rights back for his book. He's re-edited it and they've put it out. And the book is just, if you've got a pop fan in the family, this is the perfect gift. This is the perfect book for them. The difference now with this new edition, they're donating a percentage of the sale each time to Crisis, which is a brilliant homeless charity in the UK, which I give money to as well. So I'm going to put links to that. Dear Mr. Popstar, this is a new edition by Dave and Derek Philpott. It is absolutely hilarious. So we've got a special interview with Dave Philpott coming in a few weeks' time. So do check that, because the way this book came about is just absolutely extraordinary, and it's such an inspiring episode. Well, look, if you've got good news, drop us a line. Come and find us. We're at bestsellerexperiment.com. There's a contact tab there. On social media, we're all over the place. Facebook is Bestseller Experiment. Twitter and Instagram is at BestsellerXP. Drop us a line there. And if you've enjoyed this, please subscribe, rate and review. Give us a rating. Big thank you to our editors, Dave and JD, as always. Julian, where can people find you online?
jbarauthor.com. I think that's JBARAUTHOR.com. author.com. Yes, I still am not decided on whether I'm keeping my Twitter account, but I'll always be there.
Exactly. We'll put links in the show notes so you can find those. Julian, thank you so much for stepping in this week, of all weeks as well. I think it's been given us extra bit of insight into Simon Scarrow and historical fiction and all that good stuff. So I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's been a joy, an absolute joy. And listeners, thanks again for listening. And until next time, happy writing. And it's a goodbye from Mark 1.
And it's a goodbye from Mark 2, Mark 2. Goodbye.